Here is the list of material you will need to complete 100% of this course. You can also download a PDF containing all the information as an additional resource. First, of course, you will need a Raspberry Pi board. And now, which Raspberry Pi board should you use for this course? I have good news for you. Even if this course is targeted to Raspberry Pi 4, well, in fact, you can also use the Raspberry Pi 3 and the Raspberry Pi 2 versions. Everything will be the same. Also, no need to worry about the additional letters in the Raspberry Pi version, such as B, B+, etc. Everything will work. You can install the Raspberry Pi operating system on all those boards, and the GPIO header is identical. So if you have an old Raspberry Pi board, don't worry, this course will work for you as well. Only for the Raspberry Pi 2 you will need a USB Wi-Fi dongle because the Wi-Fi was not already integrated on the board at that time. If you get the Raspberry Pi 4, you will be able to choose different configurations for the RAM. 2 GB, 4 GB or 8 GB. There was a 1 GB version previously, but they are not selling it anymore. If you have this one, it's perfectly fine. So when choosing the RAM, of course the more the better, but it also becomes more expensive. I personally use the 2 GB version and it works perfectly fine for most of the projects. I would recommend buying 2 or 4 GB version. Unless you plan on executing high demanding programs, 8 GB is something you probably don't need. Then you need a power supply for your Pi. If you buy your Raspberry Pi with a kit, you should already have one included. If not, then you will need to get one. Note that a good smartphone charger is totally fine and it's what I use without any problem. The only thing you should avoid to do is to power your Raspberry Pi directly from your computer with a USB cable. This will power the Raspberry Pi, right? But the current won't be enough for the board to run well, and you can expect all sorts of errors and problems when running your board. So either use a power supply specifically designed for Raspberry Pi, or use a phone charger with at least 5 volt and 2 amp. If you use the Raspberry Pi 4, aim for 3 amp if possible, and 2.5 amp for the previous versions of the board. The third and final part you need if you just want to run your Raspberry Pi solo is a micro SD card. When choosing which micro SD card you want to use for your Raspberry Pi, there are two important factors: the class of the SD card and the storage capacity. First, make sure you get a card with class 10 and not lower. The class 10 symbol should look like this, a 10 inside a circle. If you have a card with less than class 10, then it will be too slow for your Pi. Some of the new SD cards are even more powerful and faster. For example, this Extreme Pro Micro SD card, and here you can see we have a number 3 inside a U shape. I won't go into details about that, but if you see that symbol, that's also a very good option. Now, about the storage capacity, I recommend you get at least 8 GB of storage so you can install the operating system and have some room for extra files or program. 8 GB is really the minimum you should aim for. If possible, I suggest you go for 16 GB, and why not 32 GB if you know you will have to store big files on your Raspberry Pi. Note that any card that is 64 GB or more will need some extra formatting so they can be used, but it's not a huge problem. And for this course, I will stick to 8, 16 and 32 GB SD cards, which is anyway more than enough for what we will need to do. Okay, and with the Raspberry Pi, the power supply and the micro SD card, you can already install the Raspberry Pi operating system, learn Python and follow most of the course. Now, if you want to be able to create the hardware circuits and do the activities related to GPIOs, you will also need the following: a breadboard, a set of wires that can connect to the breadboard and the Raspberry Pi GPIOs. You will need male to female wires, male to male wires, and female to female wires. You will need a set of resistors we will use 1 kilo ohm and 10 kilo ohm resistors in this course, but if you don't have those, you can also get resistors as low as 330 ohm and as high as 20 kilo ohm. I will give more details during the course. Usually the best thing you can do with resistors is just to get a complete set with many different values like what you see on the screen. It's really quite cheap. Then you will need 3 LEDs with the color you want, it really doesn't matter. And finally a push button with 4 legs like this one. For all those components, breadboard, wires, resistors, LEDs and push buttons, usually you can easily find kits that contain everything. Just search for breadboard kits and you will find some. Also, if you already worked with Arduino previously and have an Arduino kit, you probably already have all of those components. So with those components, you can do almost all sections in this course. Now, for 2 sections at the end and the final project, you will also need a PIR sensor, which is a passive infrared sensor. Here is the reference of the sensor, HCSR501. I suggest you buy a set of 2 or 3 minimum. Usually it's almost the same price whether you buy 1 or you buy 3. It will be especially useful to have more than one if you buy the cheap ones, where there is a higher chance of getting a sensor not working correctly. And the last hardware component is the Raspberry Pi camera module version 2. Note that you have 2 models for the camera. The standard one with a green board and the noir version with a black board. The black version is perfect for working in the dark, but won't produce good looking photos in daylight compared to the standard green version. So for this course, I will be using the standard one, and this is the one I recommend if you're just getting started and you don't have a specific project which requires working in the dark. Either way, all of the instructions will work for both cameras. Well, that's it for the list of parts for this course. If you already have a Raspberry Pi board, you can start the course right now while waiting for the other parts.